If you enjoy my channel, please give me a like, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you so much.
Empty apartment, heavy hearts. Have you ever looked around a silent room and suddenly realized you might have made the biggest mistake of your life? Not a dramatic movie mistake. Not the kind with explosions or police sirens. I mean the quiet kind. The dangerous kind. The kind where you sit on the floor of an empty apartment in America at 2 in the morning, staring at a microwave that doesn't work. Wondering if love is enough to survive fear, debt, loneliness, and a language that still sounds like fast radio static in your ears. That was me. And beside me was my husband, wearing 2 sweaters because we couldn't afford to turn the heater on all night. This video is not about perfect English. It's not about rich people with perfect American lives. This is a real English story practice about building a home from nothing. About marriage, culture shock, survival, and the strange way love sometimes grows stronger inside chaos instead of disappearing from it. Because sometimes people don't quit English because they are lazy. Sometimes they quit because life is loud. Bills are loud. Loneliness is loud. Fear is loud. And when your brain is drowning in stress, even simple English feels impossible. Science actually proves this. Researchers studying stress and language learning found that anxiety overloads working memory, making it harder for the brain to process new vocabulary and sounds. In simple words, your brain stops acting like a student and starts acting like a smoke alarm. That was exactly what happened to me during our first week in the United States. The apartment smelled like old paint and instant noodles. Outside the window, snow fell slowly onto a parking lot filled with giant pickup trucks that looked bigger than my future. America felt enormous. Loud. Fast. Even the grocery stores looked aggressive. Back home, I thought moving to the United States would feel exciting every day. Movies lied to me. Nobody tells you that your first nights in America might feel painfully quiet. No family. No close friends. No familiar food. Just fluorescent apartment lights and the buzzing sound of a cheap refrigerator that somehow sounded judgmental. My husband tried to make me laugh that first night. He opened the empty kitchen cabinet and said, "Look. Minimalist lifestyle. Very American." I laughed for 3 seconds. Then I cried for 30 minutes. That's marriage sometimes. One person becomes a comedian because the other person is falling apart. The strange thing about moving to America is that tiny problems suddenly become emotional disasters. Imagine standing inside Walmart trying to buy toothpaste while your brain translates every label like it's decoding ancient Egyptian symbols. Whitening toothpaste. Sensitive toothpaste. Extra fresh toothpaste. Charcoal toothpaste. At one point I almost bought dog shampoo because the packaging looked confident. And confidence matters when you're overwhelmed. Even simple conversations feel like mental push-ups. How are you today? Normal question, right? But when you're nervous, your brain suddenly opens 17 tabs at once. What did they say? Should I smile? Too much smiling? What tense do I use? Why are Americans asking how I am while walking away at full speed? Meanwhile, the other person already left the conversation 3 seconds ago. The hardest part wasn't grammar. It was identity. Back home, I was funny. Smart. Confident. In America, I suddenly sounded like a confused child asking where the rice aisle was. That feeling changes people. Psychologists call it language identity loss. When people cannot fully express personality in another language, confidence drops dramatically. You don't just feel quiet. You feel invisible. And invisibility is dangerous in a marriage. Because stress turns tiny moments into emotional earthquakes. One night my husband forgot to buy eggs after work. That's it. Just eggs. But somehow we ended up arguing about money, immigration paperwork, exhaustion, and our entire future in America. Amazing what one missing carton of eggs can accomplish. At one point I asked him, "What if we fail here?" He didn't answer immediately. That silence scared me more than any argument. Outside, snow kept falling under the yellow streetlights. I remember watching people walk confidently through the parking lot carrying shopping bags and hot coffee like they belonged here naturally. I wondered if we ever would. The funny thing is, humans are terrible at understanding growth while it's happening. You think transformation looks dramatic. But most real transformation looks boring. It looks like repeating simple English sentences at midnight while folding laundry. It looks like watching children's cartoons because the voices speak slower. It looks like practicing "excuse me" 10 times before entering a store. Tiny actions. Tiny improvements. But tiny things repeated every day become entire lives. That realization started changing me slowly. Every night, my husband and I began reading simple English stories together after dinner. Slowly. Patiently. Sometimes we repeated one sentence 5 times. "I would like a coffee." Simple sentence. But in that tiny sentence was courage. Because confidence is not built during perfect moments. It's built during awkward ones. Sometimes we laughed at our pronunciation mistakes so hard we forgot we were struggling financially. Sometimes we accidentally created completely different meanings. One time my husband proudly told a cashier, "My wife is very hot." He wanted to say I felt hot because the store heater was strong. The cashier looked at me. I looked at the cashier. My husband looked proud of himself for improving English. Honestly, I let him enjoy the victory. That's survival too. People watching this video right now might secretly feel stuck in their own life. Maybe your English feels slow. Maybe your marriage feels tired. Maybe you feel behind everyone else online pretending to have perfect lives. But listen carefully. Most people are not failing. They are simply exhausted. There's a difference. An exhausted brain says, "I can't do this." A calm brain says, "I need rest, practice, and time." That small difference changes everything. Looking back now, I realize that empty apartment was not the beginning of our failure. It was the beginning of our real life. Because when two people stand inside uncertainty together and still choose kindness, something powerful happens. Love stops being fantasy. It becomes construction work. Messy. Slow. Uncomfortable construction work. And we were about to discover just how difficult building a home from nothing could become in America. Especially when winter was only getting started. The coldest winter shock. Nobody warns you that cold weather can change your personality. I used to think winter in America looked romantic. Snowflakes. Christmas lights. Couples drinking coffee while wearing giant scarves like movie characters with emotionally stable lives. Then I experienced my first real American winter. And suddenly I understood why people in cold places walk fast, talk fast, and sometimes look personally offended by the air itself. The cold didn't just touch my skin. It entered my mood, my energy, my marriage. Even my motivation to learn English started freezing. One morning I woke up at 5:30 a.m. because our apartment windows were making strange cracking sounds. I thought something was broken. My husband walked to the window, looked outside, and whispered, "Oh no." Everything was white. Not cute white. Aggressive white. The parking lot disappeared under thick snow. Cars looked like abandoned marshmallows. Even the trees looked stressed. I remember staring outside thinking, humans were not designed for this. Back home, winter meant maybe wearing a jacket. In America, winter felt like survival training designed by a very angry scientist. And here's the strange psychological part nobody talks about. Climate shock affects your brain more than people realize. Studies on seasonal stress show that extreme weather changes sleep patterns, emotional stability, and mental energy. When sunlight disappears earlier, many people feel more anxious, tired, and emotionally sensitive. Add immigration stress and language pressure into the mix. Your nervous system basically starts buffering like weak Wi-Fi. That explained why I suddenly cried in the cereal aisle 3 days later. Not because life was tragic. Because I couldn't find the cereal my husband liked, the store music felt too loud, and an old man accidentally bumped his shopping cart into mine. My brain simply gave up. Immigration life is weird like that. Your emotions become dramatic over tiny things because your nervous system is already overloaded. Meanwhile, my husband was trying very hard to stay positive. Every morning he drank cheap coffee from a giant mug that said "good vibes only," which honestly felt emotionally disrespectful considering our financial situation. One afternoon he came home from work completely frozen. His gloves were wet. His shoes were wet. His soul looked wet. He sat on the floor near the heater and said, "I think America is trying to kill me slowly." I laughed harder than I should have. Probably because exhausted people laugh at ridiculous moments. It's cheaper than therapy. That winter, both of us worked low-paying jobs while trying to improve our English at the same time. People online make this journey look inspiring and cinematic. They skip the ugly parts. Like standing outside for buses in freezing wind while repeating English phrases quietly to yourself. How are you? I'm doing well. Have a nice day. Tiny survival phrases. Tiny pieces of confidence. Sometimes I practiced English inside grocery stores just to force myself to speak. I would intentionally ask employees questions even when I already knew the answer. Where's the milk? Which bread is cheaper? What time do you close? Simple conversations. But every successful interaction felt like winning a small psychological battle. And science supports this too. Researchers studying language acquisition discovered that repeated low-pressure speaking situations help reduce communication anxiety over time. In simple words, your brain stops panicking when it realizes you survived embarrassment yesterday. That helped me more than grammar books ever did. But emotionally, winter was still crushing us. The hardest nights happened after work. Because daytime keeps you distracted. Nighttime forces honesty. One evening our heater stopped working for almost 3 hours. We wrapped ourselves in blankets and sat together eating instant noodles while our breath became visible in the apartment air. Honestly, it felt less like adulthood and more like 2 raccoons hiding inside a refrigerator. That night my husband suddenly asked me something strange. If we had stayed home, do you think we would have been happier? The question sat heavily between us. You know those moments where time feels physically slower? This was one of them. Because deep down, every immigrant secretly asks that question eventually. Did we chase opportunity? Or did we abandon peace? I didn't answer immediately because the truth was complicated. Back home, life was familiar. Comfortable. Predictable. But predictable is dangerous too. Sometimes comfort slowly shrinks your dreams without you noticing. America scared me every day. But it also forced growth every day. I was becoming braver here, even while terrified. That contradiction confused me. At that exact moment, snow hit the apartment window hard from the wind outside. My husband looked exhausted. Older somehow. Like stress had quietly added years to his face. So I told him the truth. I don't think happiness comes from countries. He looked at me carefully. I continued. I think happiness comes from feeling alive again. Silence. Then he smiled slightly. Not movie scene smiling. Real tired person smiling. The kind that says, I'm struggling too, but thank you for staying. That moment changed something between us. Not magically. Life didn't suddenly become easier. Bills still existed. Our English still sounded awkward sometimes. And the winter somehow became even colder. But emotionally, we stopped fighting the same battle alone. That matters more than people realize. Psychologists studying long-term relationships found that couples survive stress better when they view problems as shared enemies instead of blaming each other. Sounds obvious. But stressed humans forget this constantly. When people feel overwhelmed, they start attacking teammates instead of the storm. We almost did that. Thankfully, winter slowed us down enough to notice it. So we created small rituals to survive emotionally. Every night we practiced English together for 30 minutes. No phones. No negativity. No talking about bills. Just simple listening and speaking practice. Sometimes we read children's books. Sometimes we watched slow English videos online. Sometimes we repeated the same sentence until pronunciation stopped sounding like a car engine failing in winter. And weirdly, those small moments became the warmest part of our day. Because language learning stopped feeling like homework. It became hope. Every new word felt like building another tiny bridge into American life. Every successful conversation made the country feel slightly less frightening. And then something unexpected happened. One snowy evening, while leaving a grocery store, an older American woman heard my accent and smiled warmly at me. She said slowly, "Your English is very good." Now objectively? My English was absolutely not very good. But she saw effort. And sometimes encouragement arrives exactly when a person is closest to breaking. I thanked her awkwardly. Then I sat in the car afterward and cried again. Apparently immigration turns adults into emotional water fountains. But these tears felt different. Not hopeless tears. Hopeful tears. Because for the first time since arriving in America, I realized something important. Maybe we didn't need to become perfect here. Maybe we only needed to keep going. And neither of us knew yet, the biggest test of our marriage was still waiting just around the corner. Learning English at night. There's a very specific type of loneliness that only appears after 10 p.m. The dishes are done. The apartment is quiet. Your body hurts from work. And suddenly your dreams start asking uncomfortable questions. Are you actually building a better life? Or are you just surviving more expensively in another country? That question haunted me every night during our first year in America. Especially inside our tiny kitchen. The kitchen was ridiculously small. If one person opened the refrigerator, the other person legally had to stop existing for a few seconds. The ceiling light buzzed like an angry mosquito. Our old table wobbled every time someone touched it. Honestly, the entire apartment felt emotionally unstable. But every night after work, my husband and I sat there together to study English. Not because we were motivated. Because we were scared. Fear is an underrated teacher. People online love saying things like, follow your passion. Manifest success. Believe in yourself. Meanwhile, real immigrants are whispering English vocabulary while reheating leftover rice because rent is due in 6 days. That's the less cinematic version of the American dream. And honestly, it's more interesting. One night I came home completely exhausted from work. My back hurt. My feet hurt. Even my eyebrows looked tired. I threw my bag onto the chair and told my husband, I can't study tonight. He nodded calmly. Then he opened our old notebook anyway. That notebook looked tragic. Coffee stains. Bent corners. Random English words everywhere like linguistic survivors of a natural disaster. Inside were hundreds of simple sentences we practiced every night. How was your day? I'm looking for work. Could you repeat that? Tiny sentences. Tiny bricks. But brick by brick, people build entire lives. That's the strange thing about language learning. Progress feels invisible while it's happening. Your brain changes quietly, like water slowly shaping stone. Neuroscientists actually explain this beautifully. When people repeatedly practice speaking and listening, the brain strengthens neural pathways connected to comprehension and pronunciation. At first everything feels painfully slow because the brain is creating new connections from scratch. Which explains why early English conversations sometimes feel like assembling IKEA furniture emotionally. Confusing. Stressful. Possibly dangerous for relationships. And our relationship definitely felt pressure. Because exhaustion changes communication between couples. Small comments suddenly sound aggressive. Simple misunderstandings become emotional documentaries. One night my husband corrected my pronunciation while we practiced together. I was trying to say vegetables. Apparently what came out sounded like vegetable disaster. He laughed. Not cruelly. Just naturally. But after a long stressful day, my brain interpreted it as betrayal, humiliation, and possibly war. So I crossed my arms dramatically and said, maybe I should stop speaking English forever. Very reasonable reaction. Completely mature behavior. My husband stared at me for 2 seconds before laughing harder. And somehow that saved the moment. Because humor interrupts emotional spirals. Psychologists say laughter lowers stress hormones and helps couples reconnect during conflict. Basically, your nervous system cannot fully panic and genuinely laugh at the same time. So eventually I laughed too. Then we practiced vegetables for 10 full minutes like two deeply confused television characters. The strange part is, those late-night study sessions slowly became the strongest part of our marriage. Not romantic dinners. Not vacations. Not expensive gifts. Just two exhausted people trying to pronounce English words correctly beside instant noodles and cheap tea. That's real intimacy sometimes. Not perfection. Participation. Outside our apartment, America still felt intimidating. Fast English. Fast people. Fast lives. Everyone looked busy and confident while I still celebrated understanding half a conversation at the pharmacy. But inside our kitchen, we created a slower world. A safe world. A world where mistakes were allowed. That matters deeply when learning a language. Research on language acquisition shows that emotional safety improves speaking confidence dramatically. People learn faster when they feel accepted during mistakes instead of judged. In simple words, your brain learns better when it's not emotionally preparing for death every time you open your mouth. So we made one important rule during study time. No embarrassment allowed. Wrong grammar? Fine. Bad pronunciation? Fine. Accidentally saying something ridiculous? Even better. One evening my husband tried practicing a sentence for customer service situations. He wanted to say, "I'm looking for a smaller size." Instead, he confidently practiced, "I'm looking for a tiny husband." I nearly fell off the chair laughing. To this day, I still don't know where the word husband came from psychologically. Maybe his brain was exhausted. Maybe America broke him temporarily. Either way, we laughed so hard the downstairs neighbor hit the ceiling with something. Honestly understandable. But something powerful was happening underneath those funny moments. We were changing. Slowly. Subtly. We started noticing English words during everyday life automatically. Store signs became readable. Movie dialogue sounded less impossible. Conversations stopped feeling like audio attacks from another dimension. One afternoon at work, an American coworker asked me a question very quickly. Normally I would panic immediately. But this time, I understood. Not perfectly. Not elegantly. But enough. And for a few seconds, the world felt different. Confidence is strange. It rarely arrives dramatically. Usually it sneaks into your life disguised as ordinary moments. That small interaction changed my entire mood for the rest of the week. Because progress creates energy. And energy creates more progress. Psychologists call this self-efficacy. When people experience small successes repeatedly, motivation increases naturally because the brain starts believing improvement is possible. That's why tiny wins matter. One understood sentence. One successful conversation. One less awkward grocery store interaction. Those moments slowly rebuild identity. Back home, I used to think fluent English meant sounding perfect. But America taught me something different. Communication matters more than perfection. Confidence matters more than accent. And kindness matters more than grammar. Most people are too busy worrying about themselves to judge your English anyway. That realization freed me emotionally. So little by little, I started speaking more bravely. At coffee shops. At bus stops. At work. Sometimes awkwardly. Sometimes incorrectly. But bravely. And my husband noticed the change before I did. One snowy night while we studied together, he suddenly looked at me and smiled. "You sound different now," he said. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You sound less afraid." That sentence stayed in my head for days. Because he was right. My English was still imperfect. But fear no longer controlled every conversation. And weirdly, the better we communicated in English, the better we communicated with each other too. Stress decreased slightly. Hope increased slightly. Life still felt difficult, but not impossible anymore. Then one night, while practicing English together at the kitchen table, my husband opened a letter from the mailbox. At first he looked confused. Then silent. Very silent. The kind of silence that changes room temperature instantly. I asked him what happened. He slowly handed me the paper. And the moment I read it, my stomach dropped. Because suddenly our little apartment, our late-night English practice, and our fragile new life in America were all about to face a problem much bigger than language. Love during financial chaos. There's something terrifying about opening a letter in America. Especially when you already know you can't afford whatever is inside. The paper shook slightly in my husband's hands while I stared at the numbers printed across the top of the page. Rent increase. Effective immediately next month. I read it twice. Then a third time. Not because the English was difficult. Because panic slows comprehension in a very special way. Scientists call it cognitive overload. Your brain receives information, but stress blocks processing efficiency. In simple words, fear turns reading into emotional soup. My husband sat down quietly at the kitchen table. Neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. The heater hummed softly in the background. Outside, snow pressed against the apartment windows like winter personally wanted involvement in our financial crisis. Finally, I asked the question both of us were avoiding. How are we supposed to pay this? He rubbed his forehead slowly. I don't know. That sentence hit harder than I expected. Because my husband was normally the optimistic one. The human version of motivational background music. Even during difficult moments, he usually found something hopeful to say. But not this time. And honestly, that scared me more than the bill itself. Money problems inside marriage are strange. They don't arrive dramatically at first. They sneak in quietly. They hide inside grocery store decisions and tired conversations. Can we afford this? Should we wait? Maybe next month. Tiny sentences. Tiny cuts. Eventually those tiny cuts become emotional bleeding. Researchers studying financial stress found that money anxiety increases irritability, emotional exhaustion, and conflict between couples. Basically, your nervous system starts treating ordinary conversations like survival situations. That explained why our apartment suddenly felt emotionally crowded all the time. One night we argued about laundry detergent for 20 minutes. Laundry detergent. Not politics. Not betrayal. Soap. Because when people feel financially powerless, the brain desperately searches for small things it can control. Suddenly toothpaste brands become psychological warfare. At one point my husband said, "Why are you angry at me?" And I answered too quickly. "I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at this life." Silence. Dangerous silence. The kind where both people realize something painfully honest just entered the room. America still looked beautiful outside sometimes. Bright stores. Clean roads. Coffee shops full of confident people typing on laptops like they had emotionally organized lives. Meanwhile, we were calculating whether buying strawberries counted as reckless financial behavior. Immigrant life has a weird emotional contradiction. You live inside opportunity, while constantly feeling one emergency away from collapse. That pressure changes relationships. Some couples become stronger. Others slowly become strangers sharing Wi-Fi and stress. I was terrified of becoming the second type. So every night after work, we kept our English practice routine alive even while exhausted. Honestly, it felt ridiculous sometimes. Imagine discussing pronunciation while your bank account looks like a medical emergency. But strangely, those study sessions protected us emotionally. Because during those 30 minutes, we stopped being two stressed immigrants drowning in bills. We became teammates again. One evening we practiced a simple sentence. We'll figure it out. We repeated it slowly several times for pronunciation. But after a while, it stopped sounding like practice. It started sounding like survival. That's the hidden power of language learning through stories and repetition. Your brain absorbs emotional meaning alongside vocabulary. Neuroscientists found that emotionally connected learning improves long-term memory retention because feelings strengthen neural associations. In simple words, your brain remembers words better when your heart is involved. And our hearts were definitely involved. A few days later, my husband picked up extra hours at work. I started taking longer shifts too. We barely saw each other during daylight anymore. One morning I woke up before sunrise and found him asleep on the couch still wearing his work clothes. His lunch container sat unopened beside him. I stared at him quietly. People talk about love like it's always exciting. Sometimes love looks like exhaustion. Sometimes love looks like two people destroying their backs and sleep schedules trying to protect each other from fear. That morning I covered him with a blanket before leaving for work. And suddenly I started crying again. Honestly, America turned me into the most emotional version of myself imaginable. Grocery stores. Snowstorms. Bills. Blankets. Everything caused tears eventually. But this cry felt different. Not hopeless. Protective. Because I realized something painful. We were both pretending to be stronger than we actually felt. Psychologists call this protective buffering. Couples under stress often hide fears to avoid worrying each other more. The problem? Both people end up feeling emotionally alone while sitting in the same room. That was happening to us. So later that night, after dinner, I finally said something honest. I'm scared all the time. My husband looked at me carefully. Then he exhaled slowly like someone finally putting down a heavy bag. Me too. That moment changed everything. Not financially. We still had problems. Still overdue worries. Still too many bills and not enough savings. But emotionally? The loneliness cracked open slightly. Fear becomes smaller when spoken out loud. That's true in relationships. And honestly, it's true in language learning too. Many people never improve English because they are secretly ashamed of sounding imperfect. They stay silent too long. But silence protects embarrassment while also protecting fear. The only way forward is awkwardness. Painfully awkward repetition. Embarrassing practice. Tiny uncomfortable conversations. That's how confidence grows. And confidence slowly started changing us. One afternoon at work, I answered a customer's question completely in English without freezing. Another coworker complimented my improvement. It was a tiny interaction, maybe 30 seconds total. But I carried that confidence home like I had won an Olympic medal for surviving adulthood. That night my husband smiled proudly when I told him the story. Then he said something unexpected. "You know, your voice sounds happier lately." I laughed immediately. "How?" "We're still broke." "Yeah," he said. "But now you sound like someone fighting instead of surrendering." That sentence stayed in my chest for days. Because maybe survival is not about avoiding chaos. Maybe survival is learning how to keep your identity alive inside chaos. And slowly, our apartment started feeling different. Still small. Still old. Still financially stressful. But warmer somehow. We cooked together more often. We laughed more during English practice. We even started joking about our situation like emotionally unstable comedians. One night we split a tiny slice of cheesecake because it was all we could afford from a bakery near work. My husband lifted his plastic fork dramatically and announced, "To luxury." I almost choked laughing. That tiny cheap dessert tasted weirdly unforgettable. Because happiness becomes sharper during difficult seasons. Your brain notices small joys more intensely when life feels uncertain. And for the first time in months, I felt hopeful again. Not because our problems disappeared. Because we were surviving them together. But life has terrible timing sometimes. Just when things finally started feeling emotionally stable, something humiliating happened inside a grocery store that would completely destroy my confidence again. And this time, the problem wasn't money. It was English. Our first American mistake. Embarrassment has a physical temperature. It starts hot in your chest. Then spreads into your face. Then suddenly your entire body feels like it wants to leave the building without you. That's exactly what happened to me inside a grocery store on a freezing Saturday afternoon in America. And honestly, for about 10 full minutes, I considered disappearing into the canned soup aisle forever. The day started normally enough. Which is usually how disasters begin. My husband and I went grocery shopping after work because our refrigerator contained exactly 4 eggs, half a bottle of ketchup, and emotional instability. Outside, snow melted into dirty gray slush along the sidewalks. Inside the store, everything smelled like coffee, bread, and capitalism. American grocery stores still overwhelmed me back then. Too many choices. Too many brands. Too many smiling cereal mascots staring into my soul at 8 p.m. And Americans shop fast. People move through grocery stores like they're competing in an Olympic event called competitive coupon survival. Meanwhile, I still needed 5 business days to understand yogurt labels. But that day felt different. I felt confident. Dangerously confident. Confidence without experience is basically emotional skydiving. Over the past few months, my English had improved. I could order coffee without panic. I could answer small questions at work. I even understood jokes sometimes instead of laughing 3 seconds late like a confused background character. So while shopping, I decided to act brave. My husband needed cold medicine, but we couldn't find it anywhere. Normally I would ask him to speak to employees because his listening skills were slightly stronger. But not this time. This time I was ready. This time I was an independent immigrant woman with growing communication skills and exactly 12% too much confidence. I spotted an employee stocking shelves nearby. Middle-aged guy. Friendly face. Blue store vest. Perfect. I walked toward him repeating the sentence in my head. Excuse me, where can I find cold medicine? Simple. Clean. Responsible adult behavior. I smiled politely and asked my question. Except that is not what came out. Because stress does fascinating things to language memory. Researchers studying second language anxiety found that nervousness can temporarily disrupt vocabulary retrieval even when learners already know the correct words. In simple terms, your brain suddenly throws random English into the conversation like a malfunctioning vending machine. So instead of asking for cold medicine, I accidentally asked, "Excuse me, where can I find cold husband?" Silence. Immediate silence. The employee blinked twice. My husband froze beside the shopping cart. And my soul left my body spiritually. Now logically, you might think, well, that's not too bad. Oh no. It became worse. Because the employee thought he misunderstood me. So he leaned closer and slowly asked, "Cold, husband?" And instead of correcting myself calmly like a mature adult, I panicked. Which made my brain even less functional. Suddenly I started explaining with hand gestures. Huge mistake. I pointed at my husband dramatically while trying to clarify. He is sick. Very cold husband. Need medicine for husband. At this point my husband looked like he wanted to apply for witness protection. The employee stared at us for 2 full seconds before finally understanding. Then he burst out laughing. Not cruel laughter. Real surprised laughter. The kind people make when life accidentally becomes a sitcom in front of them. And honestly, that somehow made it worse and better at the same time. Because now I was embarrassed. But also laughing too. Meanwhile my husband abandoned all emotional loyalty and laughed so hard he had to hold the shopping cart for support. Traitor behavior. Absolute betrayal. The employee finally pointed us toward the medicine aisle while still smiling. And as we walked away, my husband whispered, "Congratulations. You invented a new medical condition." I wanted to stay angry. But the situation was objectively ridiculous. So eventually I laughed too. Right there beside the vitamins and discounted cookies. And something important happened in that moment. Something small, but life-changing. I survived embarrassment. That sounds simple. But psychologically, it matters deeply. Fear controls people through avoidance. Your brain remembers painful social moments and tries protecting you from future humiliation. That's why so many people stop practicing English after one awkward experience. But psychologists call this catastrophic thinking. Your brain treats embarrassment like danger, even though most embarrassing moments disappear from other people's memories almost immediately. The grocery store employee probably forgot us within 20 minutes. Meanwhile, I almost turned it into a lifelong emotional documentary. Humans are dramatic like that. Later that night, while we practiced English together at the kitchen table, my husband kept randomly saying, "Cold husband." Every 10 minutes. like a deeply annoying comedian with only one joke. Eventually I threw a napkin at him. Marriage is beautiful. But secretly, I was grateful. Because that embarrassing moment changed my relationship with English forever. Before that day, I believed mistakes were proof of failure. After that day, I realized mistakes were proof of participation. Big difference. Children become fluent partly because they are fearless about sounding ridiculous. Adults struggle because embarrassment feels socially dangerous. But fluency grows through repetition, correction, and survival of awkward moments. Not perfection. Never perfection. And weirdly, after the grocery store disaster, I became more confident speaking English. Not less. Because the worst thing happened already. I embarrassed myself publicly. And guess what? The earth continued spinning. No one screamed. No dramatic music played. I simply became another tired immigrant accidentally saying nonsense in public America. Honestly, that country has seen worse. A few days later, something surprising happened at work too. A customer asked me a complicated question very quickly. Normally I would panic immediately and ask someone else for help. But this time I stayed calm. I listened carefully. I answered slowly. And somehow, the conversation worked. Not perfectly. But successfully. That moment felt enormous. Confidence after embarrassment feels stronger because it's realistic. You stop chasing perfection and start trusting recovery. That's emotional growth. And emotional growth changed our marriage too. My husband and I laughed more after that grocery store moment. Stress still existed. Bills still existed. America still felt confusing sometimes. But fear lost some power over us. Especially fear of judgment. One snowy evening we walked home carrying grocery bags while cold wind hit our faces aggressively. My husband suddenly looked at me and smiled. "You know what's funny?" he asked. "What?" "When we first came here, we were scared to speak one sentence." I nodded. "And now," he continued, "you're out here inventing entire new illnesses in English." I laughed so hard I almost dropped the milk. But then he said something quieter. "I'm proud of you." That sentence hit me unexpectedly hard. Because improvement often feels invisible to the person struggling through it. You only notice how far you've come when someone else points behind you. That night, for the first time since arriving in America, I looked around our tiny apartment and didn't see failure anymore. I saw progress. Messy progress. Tired progress. Cheap furniture and overdue bills progress. But real progress. And deep down, I started believing maybe we actually could build a life here together. Neither of us realized yet, life was about to become much more serious. Because soon, our little love story in America would stop being only about survival. It was about to become about family. Tiny baby, bigger fears. Nothing exposes your fears faster than a positive pregnancy test in a small apartment with unpaid bills. Especially in America. Especially when your English still occasionally sounds like a confused GPS system having an emotional breakdown. I remember staring at the test in complete silence while my husband stood beside me blinking like his brain had temporarily disconnected from reality. 2 pink lines. That's it. Just 2 tiny lines capable of transforming grown adults into nervous philosophers overnight. My first emotion wasn't excitement. It was panic. Massive, chest tightening, calculator opening panic. Because suddenly every problem in our life became larger. Rent. Healthcare. Work schedules. Insurance. Language barriers. Even our tiny apartment suddenly looked dangerous somehow. The kitchen table had sharp corners. The bathroom floor looked slippery. The heater sounded suspicious. Fear changes your imagination dramatically. Meanwhile, my husband sat down slowly and whispered, "We're going to be parents." He smiled while saying it. A real smile. Not one of those exhausted survival smiles we had been using for months. This one looked soft. Hopeful. Terrified, but hopeful. And weirdly, that made me cry harder. Because deep down, I didn't feel ready for this life. Not emotionally. Not financially. Not linguistically. Honestly, I still celebrated successful phone calls like Olympic achievements. Now suddenly I was supposed to raise a child in another country? My brain immediately started creating disaster scenarios at professional speed. What if our baby gets sick and I can't understand doctors? What if we can't afford childcare? What if our child grows up embarrassed of our accents? What if we fail as parents the same way we feared failing in America? Psychologists actually explain this phenomenon clearly. During major life changes, the brain increases threat forecasting, meaning anxious people start mentally rehearsing worst-case scenarios constantly. It's the nervous system trying to protect you by imagining danger early. Very thoughtful biologically. Absolutely exhausting emotionally. That night neither of us slept much. The apartment was dark except for weak streetlight glowing through the curtains. Snow fell softly outside while I stared at the ceiling listening to my husband breathe beside me. And suddenly I realized something strange. For the first time since moving to America, leaving was no longer simple. Before pregnancy, failure still felt temporary. We could always go home someday. Restart life. Recover quietly. But now another human life was connected to our choices. That realization felt heavy, beautiful, and terrifying. The next few weeks became emotionally chaotic. Pregnancy hormones mixed perfectly with immigration stress like two unstable chemicals, creating dramatic reactions every afternoon. One minute I felt hopeful. The next minute I cried because the grocery store ran out of the yogurt I liked. Again, America turned me into an emotional documentary series. Meanwhile, my husband became strangely protective overnight. Suddenly he researched everything. Baby costs. Hospitals. Health insurance. Parenting videos. At one point he spent 40 minutes comparing baby strollers online even though we barely had money for groceries. Fear makes people prepare obsessively sometimes. It creates the illusion of control. And honestly, watching him try so hard made me fall in love with him differently. Not romantically. Deeper than romance. He looked scared too. But he kept moving anyway. That's courage actually. Not fearlessness. Movement despite fear. One evening we attended our first medical appointment together. I was nervous for many reasons, but mostly because medical English sounded terrifyingly complicated. Normal conversations were already difficult sometimes. Now people were discussing blood pressure, insurance coverage, vitamins, appointments, and paperwork at approximately the speed of a Formula One race car. Fantastic. Exactly what my anxious immigrant brain needed. Inside the clinic waiting room, my husband squeezed my hand gently while we filled out forms together. I noticed something interesting. Months earlier, we would have panicked immediately in this situation. But now, we handled it differently. Slower. Calmer. Because our English had improved enough to survive everyday life better. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough changes everything. That's an important lesson for language learners watching this story right now. Many people quit because they imagine fluency as perfection. But real life rarely requires perfection. It requires functionality, connection, persistence, tiny improvements repeated consistently. Researchers studying adult language learning found that confidence grows faster when learners focus on communication success instead of grammatical perfection. In simple words, your brain becomes braver when you stop demanding flawless performance. That mindset saved me inside that clinic. Did I understand every word? Absolutely not. But I understood enough to ask questions slowly. Enough to communicate. Enough to survive. And survival slowly became confidence. A few months later, something unexpected happened too. My husband started speaking English more naturally at work. Coworkers talked to him more often. Customers understood him more easily. One night while eating dinner, he suddenly told me, "I think people are finally hearing me instead of just hearing my accent." That sentence stayed in my mind. Because immigrants understand that feeling deeply. Sometimes people don't realize how exhausting it is when your intelligence gets hidden behind imperfect language. You know who you are internally, but communication delays people's ability to see it. And now slowly, America was finally seeing us more clearly. At the same time, our fears about becoming parents kept growing too. Money disappeared faster. Medical bills arrived constantly. Our apartment somehow became smaller every week. Baby items appeared everywhere like adorable financial warnings. Tiny socks. Tiny blankets. Tiny terrifying expenses. One night my husband held up a ridiculously small baby shoe and whispered, "How can something this tiny cost this much?" Honestly valid question. America prices baby products like newborns arrive expecting luxury lifestyles immediately. But underneath the stress, something beautiful was happening too. We were becoming a family before the baby even arrived. Every night we still practiced English together, but now the conversations changed. Instead of, "How was work?" we practiced, "How do we calm a baby? Where is the pediatric clinic? Can you help me?" Simple parenting phrases. Simple future-building phrases. And slowly our apartment stopped feeling temporary. It started feeling like the beginning of something real. One evening after dinner, I sat quietly beside the window watching snow fall outside while my husband assembled a second-hand crib we bought online. The instructions were confusing. The screws looked suspicious. At one point the crib leaned sideways like it had emotional problems. But my husband kept trying anyway. Sweating. Laughing. Failing. Trying again. And suddenly I realized something important. Building a family looks exactly like learning a language. Messy. Awkward. Full of mistakes. But if people stay patient long enough, meaning slowly appears. That night, after finally finishing the crooked little crib, my husband looked at me proudly and asked, "So, do you think we can actually do this?" I stared at the tiny crib for a long moment. Then at our small apartment. Then at him. And for the first time since arriving in America, I answered without fear. Yes. But life loves testing confidence the moment people finally start believing in themselves. Because only a few weeks later, one terrible night would push our marriage closer to breaking than ever before. The night we almost quit. There's a dangerous moment in every difficult life season when exhaustion stops feeling temporary. That's when people start saying things like, "Maybe this just isn't worth it anymore." Not dramatically. Quietly. Like someone slowly turning off lights inside themselves one room at a time. That moment arrived for us on a Thursday night in late winter. And honestly, I still remember the sound of the apartment door closing harder than normal. Because sometimes relationships don't break during huge disasters. Sometimes they crack from accumulated exhaustion. Tiny stress. Tiny disappointments. Tiny fears. Stacked together like emotional laundry nobody folded for months. That entire week had already been terrible. My husband was working extra shifts. I was physically exhausted from pregnancy. Bills kept arriving like America had personally subscribed us to financial anxiety premium membership. And our apartment suddenly felt smaller than ever. The sink leaked constantly. The heater made strange noises again. The upstairs neighbor apparently enjoyed midnight furniture wrestling tournaments every evening. Nobody slept properly. Nobody relaxed properly. And when humans stop resting, the brain becomes emotionally stupid. Science actually confirms this. Sleep deprivation reduces emotional regulation and increases conflict sensitivity. In simple words, tired people start reacting to small problems like raccoons defending garbage territory. That was us. Two sleep-deprived immigrants arguing emotionally inside a freezing apartment over absolutely ridiculous things. That Thursday night, my husband came home late from work looking exhausted. His shoulders slumped forward. His shoes dragged slightly across the floor. I could tell immediately something was wrong. I asked softly, "Are you okay?" And he answered with the most dangerous phrase stressed people use. "I'm fine." Nobody in human history has ever said "I'm fine" like that and actually meant it. He dropped his keys onto the table harder than usual. Then he opened the refrigerator and stared inside silently for several seconds. Finally he asked, "Didn't we have more food?" Now logically, this was not an attack. But emotionally? My exhausted pregnant brain translated it into, "You are failing at life." So I snapped immediately. "Well, groceries cost money." Wrong response. Instant escalation. My husband turned around. "I know that." "Then why ask?" "I was just asking." Doesn't sound like asking. Amazing. Two adults emotionally speedrunning relationship destruction beside expired yogurt. The argument exploded faster after that. Not because of food. Never because of food. Arguments are rarely about the surface topic. Psychologists call this displaced emotional conflict. Stress from larger fears gets redirected into smaller, safer arguments. We weren't fighting about groceries. We were fighting about fear. Fear of failing. Fear of parenthood. Fear of money. Fear of America. Fear that maybe love alone could not carry this much pressure forever. At one point my husband suddenly shouted, "I don't even recognize our life anymore." Silence hit the apartment instantly. That sentence landed heavily. Because deep down, I understood exactly what he meant. We used to laugh more, sleep more, dream more. Now life felt like constant survival management. Work, bills, English, stress, repeat. Even our conversations had become functional instead of emotional. Did you pay this? What time is your shift? Can we afford that? No wonder we were breaking down. Human beings are not machines. The brain needs joy, connection, and rest to stay emotionally healthy. Chronic stress floods the nervous system with cortisol, making patients weaker and anxiety stronger over time. Basically, prolonged stress turns ordinary couples into emotionally unstable roommates with shared responsibilities. That night, our tiny apartment suddenly felt unbearably heavy. I stared at my husband and asked the question I had secretly feared for months. "Do you regret moving here?" He looked shocked. Then angry. Then tired again. And after a long silence, he whispered, "I don't know anymore." That answer crushed me. Not because it was cruel. Because it sounded honest. And honest pain hurts differently. I grabbed my coat immediately and walked outside before crying in front of him. Cold air hit my face hard the moment I stepped outside. Snow covered the sidewalks quietly under yellow streetlights. Cars moved slowly through the dark streets while distant sirens echoed somewhere far away. America suddenly felt enormous again. Too enormous. I sat alone on a freezing bench near the apartment parking lot, holding my stomach gently, trying to calm my breathing. And for the first time since arriving in the United States, I seriously thought about giving up. Not just on America. On the dream itself. Maybe we were trying too hard. Maybe some people simply weren't built for this kind of life. Maybe love becomes smaller under pressure instead of stronger. The terrifying thing about hopelessness is how logical it sounds when you're exhausted. Your brain starts collecting evidence carefully. See? You're struggling. See? You're tired. See? Nothing feels stable. That's how despair works psychologically. It narrows perspective until temporary pain starts looking permanent. But then something unexpected happened. While sitting there freezing emotionally and physically, I noticed another apartment window nearby glowing softly through the snow. Inside, a family sat around a dinner table laughing together. Nothing luxurious. Nothing cinematic. Just ordinary warmth. And suddenly I remembered something important. Every stable life probably looked chaotic at some point. Every family struggles privately in ways outsiders never see. Social media hides this reality beautifully. People post success, not survival. Nobody uploads videos called, "Today we argued about groceries and cried near frozen parking lots." But real growth often looks exactly like that. Messy. Uncomfortable. Incomplete. I sat there for almost 20 minutes thinking quietly. Then my phone buzzed. A message from my husband. "I'm sorry." 3 words. Simple words. But emotionally enormous. A few seconds later another message appeared. "I'm scared too." That one broke me completely. Because suddenly the argument looked different. We weren't enemies. We were two frightened people accidentally throwing stress at each other while trying to survive adulthood in another country. Huge difference. So I walked slowly back to the apartment. When I opened the door, my husband stood there waiting awkwardly beside the kitchen table looking emotionally exhausted. Honestly, he looked like a man who had lost an argument with life itself. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "I don't regret you." That sentence hit me harder than anything else all night. Not, "I don't regret America." Not, "I don't regret moving." Just, "I don't regret you." And somehow, that mattered more. Because stability doesn't always come from circumstances. Sometimes it comes from knowing someone is still choosing you during difficult seasons. Psychologists studying resilient marriages found that successful couples often maintain emotional connection during stress by repairing conflict quickly instead of avoiding conflict completely. Healthy relationships are not conflict-free. They are repair-efficient. That night became our first real repair. We sat together on the kitchen floor eating cheap instant noodles at midnight while apologizing awkwardly between bites. Very glamorous marriage content. Hollywood would absolutely hate it. But honestly, it was one of the most important nights of our lives. Because we finally stopped pretending to be strong individually. And started becoming strong together. Later that night, before sleeping, my husband placed one hand gently on my stomach and whispered softly, "We're going to figure this out." Months earlier, that sentence sounded impossible. Now it sounded believable. Not because life became easier. Because we finally understood something deeper. Love does not remove chaos. It gives people a reason to survive it. And neither of us realized yet, the next few months were about to change our confidence, our future, and our identity in America forever. English changed our confidence. Confidence doesn't arrive like fireworks. It arrives quietly. One ordinary day, you answer a question without panicking, and suddenly realize fear is no longer driving the conversation. That's how it happened for me in America. Not dramatically. Not perfectly. Just slowly enough that I almost missed it happening. A few weeks after the worst fight of our marriage, life started shifting in small invisible ways. The bills still existed. Our apartment still looked like a furniture collection assembled entirely from discounts and emotional resilience. My husband still worked exhausting shifts. But something inside us had changed. We stopped seeing English as a school subject. It became survival. Connection. Freedom. And strangely, confidence started growing in places we never expected. One morning I walked into a coffee shop before work. Normally I rehearsed my order silently 10 times before reaching the counter. Classic immigrant behavior. You practice one sentence internally like your future depends on correctly requesting caffeine. But this time, something different happened. The barista asked, "How's your morning going?" And without freezing, I answered naturally. Not perfectly. Not with movie-level fluency. But naturally. Then she smiled and continued the conversation casually. Just a tiny interaction. Maybe 15 seconds total. But when I walked out holding my coffee, the entire city looked different somehow. That's the psychological power of small victories. Researchers studying language confidence found that repeated successful social interactions reduce communication anxiety dramatically over time. Each positive experience teaches the brain. See? You survived. Eventually your nervous system stops treating conversations like bear attacks. That's when growth accelerates. And growth started happening everywhere. At work, customers understood me more easily. At stores, I stopped avoiding employees. Phone calls became slightly less terrifying. Honestly, calling places in English used to feel like participating in a live hostage negotiation emotionally. Now I could survive short conversations without mentally collapsing afterward. My husband noticed the change too. One evening after dinner he watched me schedule a medical appointment over the phone completely in English. When I finished, he stared at me dramatically and whispered, "Who are you?" I laughed. But secretly, I understood the reaction. Because language changes identity. Not your core personality, but your access to it. Months earlier, I had thoughts, humor, opinions, intelligence, but English trapped most of it inside my head. Every sentence felt delayed by fear. Now words moved faster. Confidence moved faster. And suddenly America felt less like enemy territory. Psychologists call this language embodiment. As people become more comfortable communicating, their personality expresses itself more naturally in the second language. In simple words, the real you finally starts showing up again. That happened to my husband too. One night he came home from work smiling for the first time in weeks. Real smiling. Not tired survival smiling. Apparently he had made coworkers laugh during lunch break telling a story in English. He sat at the kitchen table grinning like a teenager and said, "They actually understood my joke." That sentence sounds tiny. But immigrants understand how huge it really is. Humor requires timing, confidence, listening skills, cultural understanding. Joking in another language feels like emotional parkour. And suddenly he was doing it naturally. We celebrated with cheap frozen pizza and store-brand soda like financially unstable royalty. Honestly, it tasted incredible. Because success feels sharper after struggle. That's another strange psychological truth. The brain experiences relief and achievement more intensely after prolonged stress. Tiny victories become emotionally memorable because your nervous system spent so long expecting difficulty. Which explains why we treated successful English conversations like national holidays. But the biggest transformation wasn't language itself. It was what language removed. Fear. Before, fear controlled almost every decision. Fear of sounding stupid. Fear of misunderstanding. Fear of judgment. Fear of failing publicly. But confidence changes how the brain interprets social situations. Neuroscientists found that repeated exposure to manageable challenges rewires threat perception over time. Your brain slowly stops labeling conversations as dangerous. That freedom changes everything. One snowy afternoon, I even helped another immigrant woman inside a grocery store. She looked confused trying to understand a coupon machine near self-checkout. Months earlier, I would have avoided eye contact immediately. But now, I helped explain it slowly in English. And afterward, while walking to the parking lot carrying groceries, I suddenly stopped moving. Because for the first time since arriving in America, I felt capable here. Not temporary. Not fragile. capable. That realization almost made me cry again. Honestly, my emotional stability during those years remained questionable at best. But something else changed too. Our marriage became lighter. Not easier exactly. Life still contained stress. Still uncertainty. Still bills multiplying mysteriously overnight like financially aggressive rabbits. But emotionally, we laughed more now. The apartment sounded happier. One evening while practicing English together, my husband accidentally pronounced focus in a way that created a completely different and deeply inappropriate word. We stared at each other silently for 1 second before collapsing into uncontrollable laughter. The poor upstairs neighbor probably thought we were running an unstable comedy club at midnight. But those moments mattered. Because joy rebuilds relationships. Researchers studying long-term couples found that shared positive experiences strengthen emotional resilience during stressful periods. Basically, happy moments act like psychological savings accounts during hard times. And slowly, we were becoming emotionally rich again. Not financially rich. Absolutely not. Our bank account still looked concerned constantly. But emotionally? Different story. One night while folding tiny baby clothes together, my husband suddenly looked at me and asked, "Do you remember how scared we were when we first got here?" I nodded immediately. Back then everything felt impossible. Ordering food. Finding work. Understanding paperwork. Talking to strangers. Even grocery shopping felt emotionally dangerous. Now those same tasks felt normal. Still imperfect sometimes. Still awkward occasionally. But normal. That's how transformation works. Not through giant moments. Through repeated survival until fear becomes familiarity. And then something happened that truly shocked me. A manager at work pulled me aside one afternoon and offered me more responsibility because customers responded well to me. At first I thought I misunderstood. Classic immigrant reflex. Whenever good news arrives, your brain checks for hidden disaster immediately. But no. He was serious. My communication had improved enough that people trusted me more. That moment stayed with me all day. Because language was no longer just helping us survive. It was opening doors. Real doors. Future doors. Opportunity doors. That night my husband and I sat quietly together after dinner while snow drifted softly outside the apartment window. Our tiny second-hand crib stood in the corner waiting for the baby. The heater buzzed gently. The kitchen smelled like soup and warm bread. Nothing looked luxurious. Nothing looked perfect. But suddenly our apartment felt different. Like home. And deep down, I realized something powerful. We did not become confident after life got easier. We became confident because we survived difficult things repeatedly. That's what growth actually is. Not becoming fearless. Becoming less controlled by fear. But life still had one more beautiful surprise waiting for us. Because very soon, our little apartment full of stress, English practice, and second-hand furniture was about to become filled with something even more life-changing. Laughter. Tiny laughter. Baby laughter. And none of us were emotionally prepared for how much that would heal. Building home from nothing. A house and a home are completely different things. A house is walls. A home is proof that people kept loving each other even while life stayed difficult. I didn't understand that when we first moved to America. Back then, I thought stability looked expensive. Big kitchens. Beautiful furniture. Calm people drinking coffee beside giant windows while soft music played in the background like emotionally healthy movie characters. Meanwhile, our apartment still looked like a survival challenge sponsored by discount stores. But something changed after the baby arrived. Suddenly, the tiny apartment that once felt cramped started feeling sacred. Not because life became easier. Actually, life became much harder. Sleep disappeared immediately. Completely. Violently. Nobody warns new parents that sleep deprivation can make intelligent adults forget basic vocabulary in both languages simultaneously. One night my husband opened the refrigerator searching for baby bottles for 5 full minutes before realizing he was holding one already. Parenthood is a beautiful neurological collapse. But mixed inside the exhaustion was something unexpected. Joy. Tiny, ridiculous, healing joy. The first time our baby laughed, my husband froze completely like someone had pressed pause on his nervous system. Then he whispered, "Did you hear that?" Of course I heard it. The entire apartment heard it. That tiny laugh somehow filled every empty emotional space we had carried since arriving in America. Researchers studying parent-child bonding found that infant laughter and smiling trigger dopamine and oxytocin release in adults, strengthening emotional attachment and reducing stress responses. In simple words, babies are tiny emotional chemists manipulating exhausted parents into continuing civilization. Honestly, impressive strategy. And slowly, our apartment transformed. Not physically at first. Financially, we were still careful about everything. Most of our furniture came from Facebook Marketplace, thrift stores, or mysterious curbside discoveries Americans apparently considered trash while immigrants considered luxury opportunities. One of our chairs made dangerous noises every time someone sat down. The couch leaned slightly left like it had given up emotionally years earlier. But somehow, none of that mattered anymore. Because home is built through repetition. Daily meals together. Late-night conversations. Shared exhaustion. Tiny rituals. Every evening after work, my husband cooked dinner while I practiced simple English stories out loud beside the baby. Sometimes I read children's books slowly, repeating sentences clearly for listening practice. At first it felt silly. Then comforting. Then strangely beautiful. Because language learning had become woven into family life itself. Not separate from life. Part of life. That's one reason story-based English learning works so powerfully. Neuroscientists found that emotional storytelling improves memory retention because the brain processes stories more deeply than isolated information. The human brain is designed for narrative connection. Which explains why those little English reading nights became unforgettable. One evening I read a simple sentence aloud. Home is where people care for each other. My husband looked up quietly from washing dishes. Then smiled softly. No dramatic speech. No movie soundtrack. Just one tired immigrant man standing beside soap bubbles and cheap kitchen towels realizing we had slowly built something real. And honestly, that moment felt richer than anything expensive. But don't misunderstand. Life was still chaotic. The baby cried at random hours like a tiny emotional alarm system powered entirely by mystery. Bills still arrived constantly. Our schedules still exhausted us. Some days we barely had energy to speak full sentences to each other. One afternoon I accidentally wore my shirt inside out to work because the baby cried all night and my brain temporarily stopped functioning as adult. Software. Nobody noticed for 3 hours. America humbles people creatively. But emotionally, we were stronger now. Because our apartment no longer represented struggle alone. It represented survival. That's different. Psychologists call this meaning reconstruction. After difficult experiences, people become more resilient when they reinterpret hardship as evidence of growth instead of failure. Our tiny apartment stopped being proof we were behind in life. It became proof we kept going anyway. And weirdly, that confidence started changing how we lived. We began inviting people over occasionally. Nothing fancy. Just simple dinners with coworkers or neighbors. At first I worried constantly about our apartment looking too small or cheap. But then I noticed something surprising. Nobody cared. People laughed. Ate food. Shared stories. Held the baby. Life happened anyway. That realization healed something deep inside me. Because comparison had secretly poisoned my happiness for years. Social media makes ordinary people feel financially inadequate constantly. Perfect kitchens. Perfect homes. Perfect vacations. Perfect marriages smiling under perfect lighting. Meanwhile, real life usually looks like reheated leftovers and laundry waiting judgmentally in the corner. But real connection rarely requires perfection. It requires presence. One snowy evening after dinner, the electricity suddenly went out across our apartment building. Everything became dark instantly. The heater stopped humming. The refrigerator went silent. Outside, snowstorm winds pushed against the windows aggressively while distant sirens echoed somewhere far away. A few years earlier, that situation would have terrified me. Now, something unexpected happened instead. My husband lit cheap candles around the apartment while I wrapped the baby in blankets. Then all three of us sat together on the couch listening to the storm outside. And strangely, it felt peaceful. No phones. No stress about pronunciation. No rushing. Just warmth. Family warmth. The kind people remember decades later. My husband looked around the candlelit apartment and laughed quietly. You know, he said, when we first got here, I thought success meant owning a giant house. I smiled. And now? He looked at me and the baby. Now I think success means wanting to come home at the end of the day. That sentence stayed inside me permanently. Because he was right. Home is emotional safety. Not square footage. Not furniture. Not status. And slowly, our little family created that safety from almost nothing. Even our English practice changed again. Now we practice through daily life naturally. Doctor visits. Parenting conversations. Bedtime stories. Grocery shopping. Tiny normal moments became language lessons automatically. And one day, while listening to my husband speaking English confidently to a customer on the phone, I suddenly realized something shocking. We no longer sounded like people visiting America temporarily. We sounded like people building a future here. That realization felt enormous. Terrifying. Beautiful. Because identity had changed quietly while we were busy surviving. America no longer felt like a test. It started feeling like part of our story. One night after putting the baby to sleep, I stood alone in the kitchen looking around our apartment carefully. Second-hand furniture. Tiny crib. Warm dishes drying beside the sink. English flashcards still taped near the refrigerator. Nothing looked impressive. But everything looked loved. And suddenly I understood something deeply. We did not build this home with money first. We built it with patience. With forgiveness. With repeated effort during difficult days. With laughter after embarrassment. With tiny brave conversations in broken English. With love stubborn enough to survive uncertainty. And just when life finally started feeling stable, America was about to challenge us again in a completely different way. Because the next lesson wasn't about survival anymore. It was about identity. About who we were becoming between two cultures, two languages, and two different versions of ourselves. American culture, new identity. Nobody tells you that moving to another country slowly turns you into two different people at the same time. One version belongs to your past. The other version keeps learning how to survive the future. And somewhere between those two people, identity gets very confusing. That realization hit me unexpectedly one afternoon while shopping with my husband and our baby at a crowded American supermarket. At first, nothing unusual happened. The baby pointed excitedly at cereal boxes like they were priceless art. My husband compared prices with the seriousness of a Wall Street investor managing yogurt futures. And I casually switched between English and my native language without even noticing. Then suddenly, I stopped walking. Because I realized something strange. English no longer felt foreign inside my mouth. It felt natural. Not perfect. Not accent-free. But natural enough that my brain stopped translating every thought manually. And honestly, that realization scared me a little. Because language changes more than communication. It changes behavior. Humor. Confidence. Even personality. Psychologists studying bilingual identity discovered that people often express slightly different emotional patterns depending on the language they are using. In simple words, different languages activate different social versions of yourself. That explained why America sometimes felt emotionally disorienting. Back home, I was quieter. More cautious. More traditional. But here, I had become more direct. Faster. More independent somehow. At first I thought I was losing myself. But later I realized something important. Growth and betrayal are not the same thing. You can evolve without abandoning who you are. Still, balancing, it was about the baby too. One night during dinner, my husband suddenly asked, "What language should we speak at home more?" Simple question. Massive emotional consequences. Because immigrant parents secretly fear strange things. What if our child forgets our culture? What if our child struggles fitting into American life? What if they feel embarrassed by us someday? Those fears sound dramatic, but psychologists actually study this deeply. Children growing up between cultures sometimes experience identity tension. Especially when home culture and outside culture feel emotionally disconnected. Basically, human beings naturally want belonging. And immigrant families often exist between worlds. That realization made me emotional again. Honestly, by this point crying had basically become part of my personality. But my husband understood immediately. So later that evening, after putting the baby to sleep, we sat quietly together drinking tea while snow fell outside the apartment windows. America still looked beautiful at night. Streetlights glowing softly. Cars moving slowly through icy roads. Apartment windows shining warmly in the distance. When we first arrived here, that beauty felt intimidating. Now it felt familiar. That difference mattered. My husband suddenly smiled and said, "You know what's weird?" "What?" "I think America changed us, but maybe in good ways." I looked at him carefully. Because months earlier, neither of us would have admitted that out loud. At the beginning, survival consumed everything. We focused only on bills, English jobs, exhaustion. But now we finally had enough emotional distance to notice the transformation itself. We were stronger communicators. More patient. More adaptable. Even our marriage felt deeper somehow. Not more romantic necessarily. More honest. Hardship removes performance from relationships eventually. After enough stress, people stop pretending and start revealing who they actually are under pressure. That's terrifying sometimes. But also beautiful. And strangely, learning English played a huge role in that transformation. Because language learning forces humility. You become a beginner again. You make mistakes publicly. You ask for help constantly. Your ego gets emotionally punched in the face on a regular basis. But over time, humility creates resilience. Neuroscientists found that adults learning difficult new skills strengthen cognitive flexibility. Meaning the brain becomes better at adapting to unfamiliar situations and uncertainty. Basically, struggling intelligently rewires confidence. And we had definitely struggled intelligently. Well, mostly intelligently. There were still chaotic moments. One afternoon my husband confidently used a new American phrase at work. "Hit me up." Except he used it completely wrong while speaking to an older manager. Apparently the manager stared at him like he had issued a physical threat. Cultural adaptation remains dangerous sometimes. But even those mistakes felt lighter now. Because embarrassment no longer threatened our identity. We understood something deeper. Belonging is not earned through perfection. It grows through participation. That lesson changed how we lived in America. We started celebrating American holidays with neighbors. Decorating small things in the apartment. Trying unfamiliar foods. Laughing at cultural misunderstandings instead of fearing them. At the same time, we protected traditions from home too. Music. Recipes. Stories. Language. That balance became important emotionally. Because identity is not a single fixed thing. It's layered. Human beings are capable of carrying multiple versions of home inside themselves simultaneously. One Saturday morning, we visited a local park as a family. The baby laughed while watching squirrels run around aggressively stealing crumbs like tiny criminals with excellent cardio. Nearby, children shouted in English while parents drank coffee and talked casually. And suddenly I realized something shocking. We no longer looked like outsiders here. Not because our accents disappeared. Not because life became luxurious. But because we had routines now. Community. Memories. Normal life. That's what truly creates belonging. Repeated ordinary moments. Psychologists call this environmental attachment. Humans emotionally bond with places through familiarity and meaningful experiences over time. In simple words, home happens gradually. That realization became even stronger later that evening. After dinner, my husband and I cleaned the kitchen together while music played softly from an old speaker near the window. The baby slept peacefully in the next room. Snow tapped lightly against the glass outside. Nothing dramatic happened. No huge speech. No cinematic breakthrough. Just peace. Simple peace. And honestly, peace felt more valuable than excitement now. Because chaos teaches people strange things. When you spend years emotionally surviving, calm moments start feeling luxurious. My husband suddenly looked around the apartment quietly. Then he asked, "Do you think our child will remember this place someday?" I smiled softly. "Maybe not the apartment," I said. "Then what?" I thought carefully for a second. The feeling. That answer stayed with both of us. Because children rarely remember exact furniture or room sizes. They remember emotional atmosphere, warmth, laughter, safety. And somehow, despite all our struggles, we had created those things here. Not perfectly, but genuinely. Later that night, while practicing simple English reading aloud before bed, I caught myself smiling unexpectedly during a sentence. Months earlier, English represented fear. Now it represented possibility, connection, future, identity itself. And deep down, I realized something profound. America did not erase who we were. It revealed parts of ourselves we never would have discovered otherwise. But life still had one final transformation waiting for us. Because years from now, the little family struggling inside that tiny apartment would eventually stand inside a completely different home. Surrounded by laughter, memories, and proof that love really can create stability inside chaos. The house we once dreamed about. Dreams are funny creatures. When people are struggling, dreams look enormous. Almost impossible. Then years later, one ordinary afternoon, you suddenly realize you're standing inside something you once cried about at midnight. That realization hit me while unpacking dishes in our new kitchen. Not luxury mansion kitchen. Not celebrity home kitchen. Just a normal kitchen. Bright windows. Enough space to walk without apologizing to furniture. A refrigerator that didn't make sounds resembling emotional collapse. And honestly, it felt unbelievable. A few years earlier, my husband and I were practicing broken English beside instant noodles in a tiny apartment while arguing about laundry detergent and survival. Now we were carrying boxes into our first real house in America. Life changes slowly. Until suddenly it looks completely different. The morning we received the keys, my husband stood outside the front door staring quietly for almost a full minute. I asked softly, "What are you thinking about?" He laughed under his breath. "I'm thinking about the apartment heater that sounded like a dying robot." That answer destroyed me emotionally. Because memory works strangely. Humans don't remember difficult seasons only through pain. Over time, the brain softens suffering and highlights meaning instead. Psychologists call this redemptive memory. People mentally reshape hardship into stories of growth, resilience, and identity. That's exactly what happened to us. The apartment that once felt humiliating now felt sacred in memory. Because that tiny place witnessed everything. Fear. English practice. Pregnancy. Arguments. Laughter. Late-night survival conversations. Our baby's first laugh. The beginning of our entire American life. And now somehow, we had survived long enough to build something bigger. Not perfect. Real. Our new house wasn't enormous, but to us it felt emotionally illegal. There was a second bedroom. An actual backyard. Closets big enough to store things instead of emotionally negotiating with jackets every winter. Even the silence sounded expensive. Meanwhile, our child ran through the empty living room laughing wildly while his footsteps echoed against the walls. That sound healed something inside me instantly. Because deep down, every difficult sacrifice suddenly made sense. Not magically. Not romantically. But honestly. Researchers studying long-term resilience found that humans tolerate hardship better when suffering becomes connected to meaningful future outcomes. In simple words, pain feels survivable when people can eventually see what it built. Standing inside that house, we finally saw it. And strangely, the thing I felt most proud of wasn't the house itself. It was the version of us that survived long enough to reach it. Because success changes meaning after struggle. When we first arrived in America, success meant money. Security. Fluent English. A better apartment. Maybe a nice car someday. But hardship educated us differently. Now success looked smaller and deeper at the same time. Dinner together without stress. A peaceful home. Confidence speaking English naturally. A child growing up surrounded by love instead of fear. That became the real dream. One evening after moving in, I found an old notebook hidden inside one of our moving boxes. The notebook from our apartment kitchen. Coffee stains still covering the corners. Bent pages full of beginner English sentences. How are you? Can you help me? I'm trying my best. I sat on the floor flipping through the pages slowly while emotions hit me unexpectedly hard. Because every sentence carried a memory. Every mistake represented courage. Every awkward phrase represented survival. My husband walked into the room and immediately started laughing when he saw the notebook. Oh no, he whispered dramatically. The cold husband era. I laughed so hard I almost dropped the notebook. Some jokes never die in marriage apparently. But then he sat beside me quietly and started reading the pages too. And suddenly the room became emotional. Not sad emotional. Grateful emotional. Because we realized something powerful. English did not just help us survive America. It helped us rebuild ourselves. Before moving here, both of us secretly feared failure constantly. We avoided risks. Avoided embarrassment. Avoided uncertainty. America destroyed that version of us quickly. Because immigration forces adaptation whether people feel ready or not. You learn resilience through repetition. Confidence through discomfort. Identity through change. Neuroscientists studying adult adaptation found that repeated exposure to manageable stress increases psychological flexibility over time. Basically, surviving difficult experiences teaches the brain. You can handle more than you think. That became the foundation of our new life. One Saturday afternoon, we invited a few friends over for dinner. Nothing fancy. Simple food. Kids running around loudly. Music playing softly in the background. At one point, I stopped in the kitchen and just listened quietly. English conversations mixed with laughter. Different accents. Different stories. Different cultures sitting together comfortably inside our home. And suddenly, I remembered the terrified version of myself from years earlier. The woman afraid to ask grocery store employees simple questions. The woman crying inside parking lots during snowstorms. The woman terrified her accent would always make her feel small. I wish I could go back and hug that version of myself honestly. Because she had no idea how strong she actually was becoming. That's the cruel thing about growth. You usually cannot see it while living through it. It only becomes visible looking backward. Later that night, after everyone left, my husband and I sat quietly in the backyard while our child slept upstairs. Warm summer air moved through the trees softly. Somewhere in the distance, neighbors laughed near another house. America sounded peaceful at night now. Familiar. Homelike. My husband leaned back in the chair and looked at the sky. Then he asked quietly, "Do you think we finally made it?" Years earlier, I would have answered differently. I would have talked about money. Careers. Fluent English. Goals. But life had changed my definition completely. So I smiled softly and answered, "I think we made it the moment we stopped surviving alone." He looked at me silently for a few seconds. Then nodded slowly. Because deep down, we both understood. The house mattered. Of course it mattered. But the real achievement was emotional. We built trust under pressure. We built family during uncertainty. We built confidence through embarrassment. We built love strong enough to survive chaos without becoming bitterness. That was the real home. Not wood. Not walls. Us. And then something beautiful happened a few days later. Our child came home from school carrying a drawing. Inside the picture was our little family standing in front of the house smiling together. Above the drawing, written carefully in slightly messy English letters, were the words, "Home is my favorite place." I stared at that sentence so long my eyes filled with tears again. Apparently after all these years, America still had the ability to emotionally destroy me in grocery stores, kitchens, and random parenting moments. But this time the tears felt peaceful. Because suddenly the entire journey made sense. And one final realization was waiting for me. The realization that love never removed the chaos from our lives. It simply gave chaos somewhere warm to live through. Love created stability. If you had visited us during our first year in America, you probably would not have predicted a happy ending. Honestly, neither would we. Two exhausted immigrants. One tiny apartment. Bad heaters. Constant bills. Confusing English. Too much fear. Not exactly the beginning of a motivational movie. And yet, looking back now, I realize something strange. The hardest years of our lives quietly built the strongest parts of us. Not because suffering is magical. Not because struggle automatically creates wisdom. But because difficult seasons forced us to choose each other repeatedly when quitting would have been emotionally easier. That's what built our home. Not money first. Not fluency first. Love first. Patient, exhausted, stubborn love. The kind that survives grocery store embarrassment, midnight arguments, pregnancy stress, freezing winters, broken English. And second-hand furniture held together mostly by optimism and screws from the wrong box. Real love. And honestly, real love is rarely glamorous. One rainy afternoon years later, I sat alone at our kitchen table while the house stayed unusually quiet. Our child was at school. My husband was at work. Outside, soft rain tapped gently against the windows. I wrapped my hands around a warm cup of coffee and suddenly remembered our old apartment again. The tiny kitchen. The buzzing ceiling light. The late-night English practice sessions. Back then, I thought those moments represented survival. Now I understand they represented construction. We were building emotional foundations before we even realized it. Psychologists studying resilient relationships found that couples create long-term stability through repeated micro-connections during stressful periods. Tiny moments of support, humor, listening, and teamwork slowly strengthen emotional trust over time. In simple words, love becomes strong through ordinary repetition. That's exactly what happened to us. Not giant romantic gestures. Tiny daily choices. Practicing English together after exhausting shifts. Apologizing after arguments. Laughing after embarrassment. Holding each other emotionally during uncertainty. Those small moments quietly built an unshakable foundation underneath our chaotic life. And strangely, English itself became part of our love story. That still surprises me sometimes. At first, language felt like a wall between us and America. Then slowly, it became a bridge. Every awkward conversation improved confidence. Every mistake reduced fear. Every tiny success expanded possibility. Eventually, English stopped representing pressure. It started representing growth. One evening, my husband and I found ourselves rereading our old notebook again. The pages looked even more worn now. Some sentences were childish. Some grammar mistakes were honestly aggressive. But every page carried history. I pointed at one sentence we practiced years earlier. "We'll figure it out." Then I smiled softly. "Remember this?" My husband laughed quietly. That sentence basically raised our family. And honestly, he was right. Because confidence is not born from certainty. It's born from surviving uncertainty repeatedly. That lesson changed everything for me. Especially as a parent. Our child now speaks English naturally. Fast. Effortlessly. Sometimes too fast, honestly. Occasionally my husband and I still look at each other during conversations like emotionally confused subtitles trying to catch up. But something beautiful happened too. Our child also learned kindness from watching our struggles. Patience. Empathy. Courage around mistakes. One night during dinner, our child mispronounced a difficult word and immediately looked embarrassed. Before I could say anything, my husband smiled warmly and said, "Mistakes mean your brain is learning." Simple sentence. Powerful sentence. Because that philosophy transformed our entire life in America. Not just language learning. Everything. Researchers studying growth mindset found that people improve faster when mistakes are viewed as evidence of progress instead of proof of failure. The brain literally becomes more resilient when challenges feel survivable instead of threatening. That explains why some people keep growing while others freeze emotionally. Fear punishes mistakes. Growth learns from them. And our family became built around growth. Messy growth. Imperfect growth. Human growth. One weekend afternoon, we visited the old neighborhood where our first apartment still stood. The building looked smaller than I remembered. Older too. The parking lot still filled with cracked pavement and exhausted-looking cars. Snow no longer covered the sidewalks now, but I could still remember those freezing nights emotionally. My husband stood beside me quietly while our child chased pigeons nearby, laughing wildly. Then he asked, "Do you miss it?" Interesting question. Because the truthful answer was complicated. I didn't miss the stress, or the fear, or the exhaustion. But part of me missed who we became there. The apartment witnessed transformation. It witnessed two frightened people slowly becoming stronger together. So I smiled softly and answered, "I miss the beginning." My husband nodded immediately, like he understood perfectly. Because beginnings are sacred sometimes. Even painful beginnings. Especially painful beginnings. They contain the rawest version of hope. And ours survived. That realization hit me deeply while driving home later that evening. For years, I believed stability came after chaos ended. But adulthood taught me something completely different. Stability is not the absence of chaos. It's the presence of connection during chaos. That changes everything. Because life never becomes perfectly calm. There are still stressful days. Unexpected bills. Arguments. Fear. Parenting struggles. Career uncertainty. Human beings never permanently arrive at peace. But love changes how chaos feels. When people face hardship alone, stress becomes isolation. When people face hardship together, stress becomes meaning. That's the real difference. One quiet night before bed, my husband and I sat together in the living room after our child fell asleep upstairs. The house was peaceful except for soft rain outside and the occasional creaking sounds normal homes make at night. I looked around slowly. Warm lights. Family photos. Books. Shoes near the front door. Ordinary things. Beautifully ordinary things. Then I realized something that almost made me emotional again. Years earlier, this exact life existed only inside exhausted late-night conversations in a tiny apartment. We imagined it before we could touch it. And somehow, love carried us there slowly. Not perfectly. Not quickly. But faithfully. My husband suddenly reached for my hand and smiled softly. "You know," he whispered, "we really built this from nothing." I shook my head gently. "No," I said quietly. "Not from nothing." He looked at me curiously. Then I smiled. "We built it from love." Silence filled the room softly after that. Warm silence. The kind people spend entire lives searching for. And honestly, maybe that's the real answer to the question we asked at the beginning of this story. Can love create stability in chaos? Yes. Not by removing the chaos, but by giving people the strength to keep building anyway. That is how we survived America. That is how we learned English. That is how we became a family. And that is how two frightened immigrants slowly built a home that finally felt safe. Sometimes the hardest part of learning English is not grammar, it's believing your life can still change. Maybe tonight you feel tired. Maybe you feel behind. Maybe you started learning English many times and secretly wanted to quit. But listen carefully. A better life is not built in one perfect moment. It is built in tiny brave moments repeated every day. One sentence. One mistake. One uncomfortable conversation. One more day you refuse to give up. That's how confidence grows. That's how families survive. That's how dreams slowly become real. And maybe, somewhere in the middle of your own chaos, you are already building a future stronger than you realize. So the next time life feels heavy, remember this story. Two people with broken English, fear, stress, and almost nothing, still built a home filled with warmth, laughter, and love. Not because life became easy. Because they kept going. If this story touched your heart or helped your English listening practice today, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video. And leave a comment sharing where you are watching from and what dream you are still fighting for. Because your story may inspire someone else who feels lost tonight. And trust me, the next story on this channel might change the way you see your own life forever. See you in the next Real English Story Practice. Slow English. Real emotions. Real life. Real growth.